My name is Daniel Mercer, and after 19 years at Crestline Systems, I thought I understood the unspoken rules of loyalty, stability, and earned respect in corporate America, which is why discovering that my boss had secretly planned to fire me felt less like a betrayal and more like waking up inside a story I didn't know I was starring in. I joined Crestline straight out of my 20s, grew with the company through recessions, mergers, rebrands, and leadership shakeups, and became the person people called when projects were behind, clients were angry, or systems were on the verge of collapse. Never flashy, but always dependable. The kind of employee executives love until they decide they want someone younger, cheaper, and easier to control. I didn't go looking for the truth. It found me by accident when an internal calendar invite popped up on my screen during a routine server sync, a meeting labeled Post-Mercer Transition Strategy, scheduled for 2 weeks later with HR, legal, and my department head, Martin Cole, a man who shook my hand every morning and thanked me publicly for my decades of dedication. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but when I quietly accessed archived planning notes tied to the meeting, my stomach dropped. There were talking points about knowledge extraction, risk mitigation, and termination optics, all tied neatly to my name, with a timeline that showed they intended to let me train my own replacement before walking me out with a scripted severance offer and a smile. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't panic. I sat there, staring at 19 years reduced to bullet points, and realized the shock wasn't that they planned to fire me. It was that they assumed I'd never find out and never push back. Over the next few days, I replayed every conversation, every vague comment about fresh energy, every sudden request for documentation I'd already provided dozens of times, and it all snapped into place. So instead of reacting emotionally, I did what I'd always done best. I prepared. I reviewed my employment contract, confirmed my non-compete limitations, backed up personal work artifacts, and quietly stopped shielding leadership from the operational realities they didn't understand because I'd always smoothed things over for them. I answered emails precisely instead of generously, referred questions back to policy instead of fixing problems off the clock, and documented decisions that were previously made through hallway conversations and wink and nod approvals. Within a week, inefficiencies surfaced, deadlines slipped, a long-standing client escalated concerns about inconsistencies only I knew how to prevent, and suddenly my calendar filled with meetings from people who had no idea how much invisible work I'd been doing to keep the machine running. The real twist came when legal requested a knowledge transfer session for continuity, and I calmly replied that I'd be happy to schedule it once my role clarity and future at the company were formally addressed, a sentence polite enough to be harmless, but firm enough to trigger alarms. HR reached out next, offering vague reassurances about no decisions being made, but by then I had screenshots, timestamps, and meeting logs saved externally, not to threaten anyone, but to protect myself from being rewritten out of my own story. 2 days later, Crestline lost a renewal contract worth 7 figures after the client demanded answers about internal instability, and when leadership scrambled, Martin finally called me into his office, closed the door, and said, "Daniel, let's be honest, we were considering restructuring," his voice tight as if honesty had a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. I listened, nodded, and said something that shifted the entire room. "I already know," then placed a printed copy of the meeting agenda on his desk, watching his face drain of color as he realized the plan hadn't been as airtight as he thought. The following week unfolded like a slow-motion collision as legal froze termination discussions, HR launched an internal review, and executives began asking why a man with nearly 2 decades of institutional knowledge was being quietly removed without cause or transition safeguards, especially after operational cracks appeared the moment I stopped compensating for leadership blind spots. The shock everyone talks about wasn't a dramatic firing or lawsuit. It was the reversal. The board stepped in, not out of kindness, but out of risk management. And suddenly the conversation wasn't about replacing me, but about retaining me, repairing trust, and explaining why someone who had carried Crestline through its most profitable years had been targeted in secrecy. Martin was reassigned within a month. HR leadership changed shortly after. I was offered a retention package, a title upgrade, and authority I'd never been given before, not as an apology, but as damage control. And I accepted not because I needed validation, but because I wanted to leave on my terms, with my legacy intact and my future secured. 6 months later, I resigned anyway, stepping into a consulting role that paid more, demanded less, and valued transparency over convenience. And when people asked why I stayed calm instead of blowing everything up the moment I found out, I told them the truth. The most shocking endings don't come from revenge fueled by anger, but from patience, preparation, and letting people expose themselves when they think you're powerless. They planned to fire me quietly after 19 years, but they never planned for me to see it coming, and that made all the difference.